So during this discussion, we want to talk about sex, about its purpose and its place in marriage, and how it can not only serve to strengthen our marriages, but also sometimes cause significant tensions in our marriages. Probably hard to argue with the fact that our culture is sex obsessed in many ways. Lots of people have pointed that out. What impact does that have, that sexual obsession of our culture? What impact does that have potentially on our marriages that it might be destructive or harmful?
It can warp your expectations
Sure.
for sex, you know? It can be like, you know, being bombarded with all of these, photoshopped images of people, it's like, well, nobody looks like that. In fact, she doesn't even really look like that, you know?
Yeah.
And so, but you're surrounded by it. That's like our ecosystem and such that, so it can change your expectations for, like you say, like, or being anxious about like, how are we supposed to be and perform?
Media and marketing certainly knows how to press our buttons, and then they go further and further down the rabbit hole of like trying to elicit chemical hormonal reactions that are effective. We're human beings and we're chemical hormonal people. And it's one thing if that's something that you see occasionally, but to have it so pervasive everywhere, especially in a billboard-based society like New York, you can't walk down the street without having a television in your face. It can start to reframe your own, I think, emotional and chemical responses to more mild stimulus. And I think that can be harmful. And there's a desensitization that happens that I think puts a very bizarre kind of stress on just what can be a very meaningful interaction between people to be a very topical interaction between people. And, what should I be wearing? Is this sexy enough? How should I be grooming myself? And it turns what is very personal and intimate into a kind of a public currency.
And it brings up this question of, like, before I even look at you, before we even consider our relationship with each other, this question of, am I enough? That actually has nothing to do with us. Am I enough in a way that actually has nothing to do with the two of us as individuals who love each other?
Yeah, I read a magazine once where it said that most guys were looking for the omni-available woman who really doesn't exist. In other words, we have these unrealistic expectations and they're bound to, in many ways, distort our marriage relationships and what goes on in them. Let me ask this question, though. How important is sex in our married lives? How important is it to the health of your marriage? What's its place in your marriage?
I think one of the great contributions to the marriage would be comedy relief. I think it's an overlooked purpose of sex.
Yes.
Many, many times my wife and I have said, boy, wouldn't people be absolutely regaled with hilarity if they had any idea of what we do?
Right.
So there we go.
Right, yeah.
Because we're laughing at ourselves.
That's right. In the movies, no one's underwear gets stuck on their leg. Right? It all magically disappears. Right. But
I think that's a shame. To me, that's a shame. Like, some of my favorite moments when we're having sex are when we laugh together. And when it's
not so serious
when it's not so
all the time.
When it's not so sexy.
Most couples, at least in the counseling that I do with married couples, from time to time, people are expressing, or one of the issues of conflict is the dissatisfaction with their sex life. It's hit a place where it's hard for them. It might have been easy for a season, but then it no longer is. Assuming this is true, at least to some degree for all of us, what have you all learned about the conflicts that you have over your sex life?
We tried to get pregnant for almost 2 years before we conceived our son. And I certainly think, sex has a lot of functions in a marriage, but we really wanted a family. It was really important to us. We were trying really hard. And I think that it was such a different experience of being together in that way that I think it's worth mentioning, because I think it's not as unusual as we believed at that time, anyways.
And I think it cuts both ways. Like, I was a product of public school sex education, which was basically to tell us all that if, like, you kissed a girl while you were wearing shorts, she was probably going to get pregnant. And that meant that when we actually tried to have kids and we realized, like, wow, this is a lot more complicated process than we were anticipating. And like trying to have sex on a schedule or by a clock, it seems sometimes utterly unromantic. But when we were able to put it in perspective of what we were doing as a family, the schedule wasn't less burdensome.
Well, we have sort of an unusual story with that. We waited until we were married to have sex, and discovered that I had a pain condition that made sex incredibly painful for me. And so for years, we struggled with that. And, I felt for a long time, I felt this incredible tension between the idea that sex was this promise of unity and like what it's going to be like with God, and all of these beautiful things that I
heard of, yeah.
Right, that I wasn't experiencing at all. And we still, honestly, like we still carry baggage from that. We are working through that. But what God has taught us through that is how, now that we're experiencing healing, how precious it is. And even though there was this season of grief and disappointment, that he saw us through it. Like he saw us through it. He stuck through it with us. And it was not the end of our marriage. And now there's quite a bit of sweetness on the other side, more sweetness for the brokenness than there would have been otherwise. Not the storyline we would have chosen.
The fact that we were going through this together, and this was, and for each of us, it was the only other person that we'd ever had sex with, we'd ever dealt, with sexual issues with, it made it that much safer and more like comfortable to be dealing with something so hard. Because I wasn't, I didn't think that, like she knew that I didn't have any other expectations from past relationships, for instance, that I was bringing to bear in this challenging time.
Actually, you may not want to hear this, but for 40 years as in marriage, physically you change. There can be all kinds of things. There are changes after multiple children. There can be surgeries. There can be, I had thyroid cancer. My wife's had quite a number of surgeries for a number of different reasons. And every time the body's actually changed. I mean, sometimes literally changed. And so the whole physical experience was completely different. And so you relearn. You find new ways of giving pleasure, new ways of being intimate, new ways of just expressing your love. And whether or not the new way was quite as physically charged as the old way, doesn't matter. And so I have to say, I can be a little cynical with people who say, I don't know if we're going to get married until we know that we have the sexual chemistry. And I say, well, you're going to have to rework that sexual chemistry about 5 times, at least, in your marriage if you're going to stay together, because you change.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you keep, in light of 40 years, and people ask me after 30 years, how do you keep having sex with the same person and finding it still a life-giving and enjoyable act? And I think
you relearn it. Yeah. But by the way, sometimes a doctor will say to you, you can't have sex until, it'll be several months because of the surgery. You can't do it. And so you still, I know what they mean. What they mean is intercourse. They mean penetration. And I'll say, well, we're going to have sex. We'll figure it out. We'll find some way of being sexually intimate. I mean, you roll with the punches, and you find a way of doing it, and you do.
Tim, in your in the book, you talk about sex a bit outside of marriage. You say the Bible does not counsel sexual abstinence before marriage because it has such a low view of sex, but because it has such a lofty one. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that.
Defend that, right?
Defend that.
Well, if you say you've actually already earlier you hinted at this. If sex is I want to get something from you, then I want the experience of a person with your incredible complexion having sex with me, then yeah, fine, that's all sex is. If sex is self-giving, if it is a kind of sacrament in which you are literally embodying what you're trying to do with your whole life, I consider that a higher view of sex. I think anybody would. If you say sex is a way of saying to someone, I make myself vulnerable here physically, but it's just a sign of making myself vulnerable in every other way. I'm willing to bind myself to you. I'm willing to live with you, commit myself to you, merge our property, be your spouse. That's self-giving. If somebody says, I want to have sex with you, but I don't want to get married to you, what you really mean is, I don't want to really give myself to you. I want to stay independent. So if sex is, I'm giving myself to you, it's a sign of self-giving, then it needs to go along with marriage, otherwise it's a lie. If you say, no, I don't want to have that high view of sex, I just want to say sex is a way of really just having fun together, fine. But I think most people would say that's a lower view of sex. And then with that definition, yes, you can have sex outside of marriage. With the definition I laid out there, which I think is the Christian one, no, you can't have it outside of marriage.
Yeah, and I'd like to say to couples at times that, hey, you actually know how powerful sex is, because when you engage in that relationship with someone that you're not married to, you feel this strong connection.
Yes.
Unless you've broken it and gotten to the place where it no longer does that for you, then you're actually even in greater danger.
Haven't you ever noticed that when you're having sex, you want to make promises? You want to say nuts, crazy things? You want to say, longer than there's been stars up in the
Fish
heaven.
in the ocean.
Yeah, what is that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to say these crazy things like, I want to be with you forever. So it's almost natural as you're having sex to make promises. And usually when the sex is over, then you are glad you didn't. That's what a lot of these people tell me. They say, gosh, that's the way it is. But I would say, I think you're probably wired, because I'm a Christian minister. I believe you were made in God's image. I think he created sex in order to give yourself to somebody else. And you're sensing that even though you don't have the doctrinal or worldview understanding of that, but you're sensing it at a certain level.
You know, without divulging too much, I've had experiences outside of marriage, and I learned a lot about myself through those experiences, and a lot of what I learned was useful and helpful and pointed me towards Sam, and a lot of what I learned, I realized through meeting Sam and being married and having sex in a marriage relationship. You know, I learned exactly how that didn't serve me, and
Yeah, me too.
good riddance.
Me too. I mean, neither of us waited until we were married to have sex. And I think in those experiences before marriage and in the experiences I had before this relationship, I learned a lot of really wonderful things. It was a process for me of tremendous self-discovery and self-growth. And I would say I look back on it largely very positively. But there were certainly experiences, to take my analogy of sex like a tool that you can use in many different ways, there are certainly some ways where I was like, wow, I don't want to handle it that way ever again.
Yeah.
I can hurt myself if I treat myself and my sexuality in that way. I can hurt other people in different situations, in different contexts.
I will say, in reading Tim's book, reading the part about the way that sex does inspire marriage-like feelings rang very true to me in a way that I hadn't considered it before. Like, no one had verbalized it to me in that way before. And when I read it, I felt like, wow, yeah, that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And that led to a lot of heartbreak for me. And I'm just glad that I was able to reconcile some of that heartbreak and some of those feelings and some of that, like, have a place to put that energy in a way, in Sam, in a way that feels constructive and healthy and building towards our relationship and our future. And I feel like now I have a very different understanding of my past than through, our relationship than I did before I met you and really learned about marriage.
Me too.
By being married.
I think many of my sexual experiences before marriage helped those relationships develop in ways that were very healthy, but I can also say that there were certainly times in which my sexual experiences before marriage pushed those relationships toward a development that the relationship itself was not ready to sustain, that my heart couldn't sustain, that my spirit couldn't sustain, that the circumstances of our lives couldn't sustain. I guess it's like every tool becomes a weapon if you hold it the wrong way. And that I've certainly seen that be the case for me as well.
Joe and Kristen, you guys said you did wait.
Yeah.
What was the impact of that on your relationship to do that, to wait?
Well, I mean, it automatically sets up really interesting conversations with your friends. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm sorry, you're doing what? Really? There's this kind of wonderful thing about the fact that we're the only people that we've each been with. So all of the fun and all of the silliness and all of the everything that comes with that, it's like it's just us. It's something that's special just for us that we're doing together. And you know, that's a gift that we get to enjoy.
So, you know, our society teaches us by and large that sex is something that is superficial, treats it pretty lightly. But I think our discussion shows that sex is actually complex, profound, rich, beautiful, powerful. Thanks for your interaction about that.
One of the ironies, I think, of discussions of sexuality is that Christianity is said to have a low view of sex. But when I look out there in the culture, on the one hand, I see people who see sex as just an appetite. Like lots of times you see in movies people saying, hey, how long has it been since you've had sex? You need to go out because it's seen as a way of just fulfillment and joy and happiness, release. So it's seen as just a biological thing, actually. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you've got people who we would call prudes, so we would call them Victorians, people who think of sex as kind of dirty. Oddly enough, they also see sex as essentially a biological appetite, sort of a necessary evil in order to procreate the race. So it's Christianity that says, no, sex has always got to be connected to self-giving love.
And the way that connection is actually best understood in Christianity is through the term covenant renewal. We talked earlier about the covenant that God makes with us. I will be your God, and we will be his people, and that we mimic that in our covenant relationship in marriage. Well, in our relationship to God, there are times when we renew our covenant to him, we recommit ourselves, we have a worship experience of great power. In marriage, sex is the way that covenant renewal takes place, that bonding, that gluing, that feeling like we're made for each other. Even, I mean, you can read science now where they say, oh, the oxytocin hormone is released and yada, yada, yada. God, we've actually been hardwired by God for sex to make us feel committed to one another. And so having sex is a covenant renewal within marriage.
Yeah, and then even related to that, an even more lofty aspect of the Christian understanding of sex is that we understand sex as pointing to our eventual union with God, in which we have given ourselves and therefore we belong completely to God, and God has given himself to us. That's the reason why we do say that sex should only be for marriage, because sex is not a way of being self-fulfilled or self-realization. It's a way of giving yourself completely to another person. It's a way of saying, I belong completely and exclusively to you. And you can only say that inside the covenant of marriage. Sam and Tara were very honest about their background, and they were moving in the direction of a sexual ethic, I thought, of the Christian sexual ethic. And yet, we know as Christians that because sex is not just a way of building up your identity, but a way of giving yourself to someone else, it's only ever for inside the covenant of marriage.
We have really enjoyed these last 5 sessions, and the next one will be our last one, and we want to return to something that's really sort of the heart of the whole matter. We're going to discuss the fact that there is a mission to marriage. Most people don't necessarily give any attention to what their marriage is about. Right. You know, we're married, but what's your marriage really about? What's the mission of your marriage? And the most fundamental plank in your mission, the mission of your marriage, is to help the other person become the glorious person that God intended them to be. So that's what we'll be discussing in our final session the next time, and we hope to see you there.